So welcome everybody to Taking the Tradition On. So I'm just going to flash up a little screen behind me. So I'm able to do this because the very wonderful Get a Word In Edgeways Festival have let me use their Zoom. So thank you very much, Get a Word In Edgeways online. So I'm on their Zoom tonight. So they're doing everything they can to sort of promote storytelling, and they're letting me use it for this as well as for their concerts. And taking the tradition on, storytelling chat show. What bizarre idea. But I have an Arts Council England grant. I've been, Duncan Williamson left me several boxes full of reel-to-reel tapes, and I've digitised those with the School of Scottish Studies, and then I had an Arts Council England award to upskill myself digitally because I was completely hopeless. So to get a bit better at using social media, to do podcasts, to do some blogging, which I'm even more grateful for now than I was before, because I would have had no hope, I think, with everything that's going on now without that little bit of help from the Arts Council. But podcasts now are a bit tricky. I can't go and interview people, and I was thinking, what am I going to do? I can't go and interview people, but here in this Zoom world, I can. So the first few of these Taking the Tradition On sort of Zoom interviews do have a little bit of a focus on Duncan Williamson, who is a fantastic Scottish traveller, storyteller, ballad singer, tradition bearer. And I've talked to various people who've known him in different ways. And tonight, my guest is the amazing Donald Smith. And Donald, I have to say, on paper, you are quite scary, really. You're completely intimidating. I mean, eminent is the word invented for you.
Oh, come on.
Well, you've been
This is media waffle. This is media waffle.
You've been involved in storytelling for over...
You're making me like Matt Hancock. Trying to tell you it's all wonderful. It's all in hand.
Well, this is only the first bit. You haven't heard what I'm going to say after this, but you got a first-class honours degree in English and classical Greek. You did all of the work at the Netherbow. You founded the Scottish Storytelling Centre. You're one of the founding directors of FES, kind of the European storytelling movement that's going on. You started the Scottish International Storytelling Festival. And it is on paper, you're really intimidating, but then I meet you, and everybody else think has met you, and you're completely not intimidating at all. You've still got all those amazing qualifications that you've got on your CV and your bit of paper, but you're also very laid back, always smiling. And I mean, there must be times when you're doing the swan thing of paddling frantically underwater, but you always make everything looks so easy, and you are always the host. So it's quite interesting for me to host you, because whenever you go into the Scottish Storytelling Centre, there is such a warm welcome, and it just feels laid back and friendly and a really happy place to be.
So it's lovely to be your guest, Amy, and it's great that you're doing this. But you know what I would just have to make absolutely clear is that my kind of experience of storytelling and life with storytelling, you know, it is a lifelong thing. It's really got, in many ways, nothing to do with all that. This happened and that happened. We can talk a bit about that. There were all these wonderful opportunities. There were all these wonderful people like Duncan and Stanley and all sorts of other people that I've learned so much from. But really, from age 7, without having it kind of identified as this is storytelling, I was very, very fortunate in experiencing storytelling as a kind of live, living tradition. That was both in Ireland and Scotland, and we could talk a wee bit about that. And yeah, so everything that I've been involved with storytelling is based on that sort of core, human and social and cultural experience. And so I've never felt a need to kind of push the thing in some kind of artificial or glam kind of way. I've just been very fortunate in my life in I just having that nurture or that culture of stories around me.
So what do you remember kind of hearing your first story? Is there a moment that you can kind of identify as going, I'm listening to a story and I love this?
Yeah, I do. And it's I've got this incredibly vivid. So I was age 7 when I first went back to Ireland, to Mid Ulster, to stay with relatives there. And that became something that I then did every year. And the very first night that we arrived, very late in this little farm way out in the back of beyond, and went to bed in this kind of bedroom. And then I just vividly remember coming to very early in the morning, and this hole had opened in the ceiling of the room, and this gigantic horny foot with the biggest toenails I had ever seen in my life descended from the hole in the ceiling. And then it was followed by the leg and the other horny foot. Now, this was Willie O'Hara, who slept in the attic, but I had no idea, or if anybody had told me about this, I hadn't remembered about it. And Willie O'Hara was, we in Scotland would say he was the Ora Loon. He was the jack of all trades about that wee rural Irish farm. But he was a creature of wonder and extraordinary, who attracted to himself a whole host of legends. He was like Rip Van Winkle suddenly descended into my life. And I identify that as a moment that I suddenly was my eyes were open to a world where wonder and kind of a sense of emotion and community and extraordinary events and extraordinary characters was everyday life. It was the substance of everyday life. And I always look back on that as a moment that was like a kind of awakening to there was this world of story that illuminated, that was part of everyday experience, but it went beyond it. It illuminated it. It made it larger than life.
He sounds completely larger than life. He sounds amazing. I mean, were you frightened of him as well?
No. And I always, there was something, always my nature open to that. And the one of the interesting things about Willie O'Hara was a channel, because he was very old by this time, and he was very open. He would have been called somebody now who had a learning disability, but he had this incredible openness to experience. So he would tell me as a child things about my great uncles and my great aunts when they were young, about my great aunt Esther's love affair with the crofter Johnny Campbell down the road. And that was an amazing story, because well, I mean, this is Ireland. This is rural Ireland in the 20th century. And of course, there were all these religious divisions. And Johnny Campbell, who was a local crofter, he was Catholic. He was a Roman Catholic, and he belonged to the nationalist community. And my aunts and uncles were all unionists, kind of, well-doing Protestant unionists. And Johnny Campbell was really keen to woo my great aunt, who even in her old age, you could see had been a looker. big style, with this wonderful hair swept back up, still black at the roots, you know. Her eyes, they shone like diamonds. You could tell she was queen of the land. And see, but of course, there was no social occasion. There was no regular social interaction. Whenever she went out, she went to market, she was under her father's wing, her mother's wing, or the rest of it. So Johnny Campbell sent a letter. Now we're talking here, this must have been 1916 or 17. He sent a love letter, which was kind of, you know, couched in all the extravagant devotion, you're the most beautiful, and I, etc., etc. But the only channel he had to get to this letter to her was through Willie O'Hara, who, but this time I would have just been in his teens and the whatever. And he was sent with the letter. And when he presented the letter, according to his version of it, my aunt took the broom to him and said, "Who gave you this? Who gave you this?" And he said, "Nobody gave me it. Nobody gave me it." "What do you mean nobody gave me it?" Well, of course, that's the Polyphemus and Odysseus story, you know, and nobody gave me it. And he was chased out. And of course, Johnny Campbell was killed in the trenches in the Somme in the First World War. My Aunt Esther never married, and she still had that letter. She still had that letter in a little kind of, you know, little dinky drawer thing she kept in her own room. She never showed me that letter, but I knew it was there. I knew it was there. So yeah, I mean, so Willie O'Hara, you know, he was a kind of channel, and I tuned in. I tuned in, age 7. I tuned in, and I never tuned out.
I think that's the thing. I think age 7 is the time for wonder, and it's that time for magic and fairy tales. And if you were really exposed to stories at 7, you are old enough to understand the complexities and the layers and to start getting a grip on that, and still just wide open to all the possibilities of the world.
Yeah.
And some people lose that. And
so two interesting things about that, and I'll bring that back to Duncan as well, actually. But you know, up to age 7, I had actually had a very dysfunctional and slightly odd childhood. Hadn't been brought up with my own parents, was adopted twice, was brought up within a very strict religious atmosphere, blah, 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 various things. And that's something it would be interesting to mention, that it's been my kind of experience over decades that many people who get involved in storytelling are people who have experienced some kind of emotional disruption or difficulty in their lives that has led them to have a sense of the importance of making connections, emotional and psychological connections, and not perhaps being boxed into a post-traumatic or a very negative kind of lager of experience. So that's something about the role of storytelling, you know. But just back to that wonder thing, of course, you see, that was the thing that I immediately recognized in Duncan when I first got to know him in the early 80s, and you know, experienced listening to him, and then had the wonderful thing of taking him to schools and chatting and working with him and all the rest. The thing that I could immediately see was he had that core sense of that inner wonder. And he was absolutely astonishing how he could tune in to kids on that wavelength. So of course he could do it with adults as well. But I many times I watched him establishing that kind of bond with kids, and something in me just kind of lurched towards that, as I thought, yes, this is a critical part of what storytelling about. And here's somebody who has an instinctive grasp of it. And that capacity to, not to charge in on kids, not charge like, Duncan would sit there and he would, he would play his Jaws harp, and he would have a wee reminiscence about when he was a kid in Argyll and living in the tent or whatever. And you remember, I started first, well, come on, Duncan, we've just got a 40-minute session here. When are you going to get started and actually tell a story, And then, of course, I just twigged that he wouldn't go into it until he felt he had that sense of connection that he could take those kids with him. And you just watched that, and it was quite extraordinary. They would physically get closer to him. It was like a kind of, as he established that bond and they relaxed, then they moved towards him. They moved towards him because there was something, he was feeding something, he was opening something up for them. And
Definitely
I just always recognized that,
of just, if you really want to take people with you and make it about us rather than I'm going to tell you something, but to be that joint journey and that kind of voyage of wonder together. He already had started telling stories. All of those stories about being young are stories anyway, but it is just that beginning is so important, and you can't rush stories. And that's the thing is, and it took me quite a long time to learn of kind of people going, oh, you've only got so long and this, that and the other, and he would just ignore it and go, well, I'll tell a short story then. But it's kind of, he would never let himself be rushed, and he would just calm everybody down and take them to his level, and when they were all ready to move at the same time. And it's such an, it's sort of, but it gave him a real sense of gravity, because it's that kind of that pull that people would just be drawn into that well of around him and orbit around him, and then you'd be able to move together. And I'm sort of slowly starting to learn that. It's taken a long time. But again, he was about, it's interesting, that 7 thing, all of those stories that he told about his childhood, he would, 7 was kind of that age when his granny, they let the stories out of the bag, and his granny said, right, somebody's let the stories go, I'm not going to tell them anymore. And that's when he really sort of stepped forward and started becoming the storyteller. And I think he was about that young.
Yeah.
He started telling those.
So there was that childhood. Then there was this other element in Duncan, though, that I was very interesting and remarkably early in his awareness. Certainly much earlier than I ever got involved with. So from a very young age, he was a conscious collector of stories. He was a connoisseur of stories. Now, that is not necessarily a typical thing from traditional culture. So that's something we might be talking about tonight, the importance of traditions of storytelling, but also the contribution of people who have a sort of beyond the immediate tradition awareness, and you can only call it really an artistic awareness of how stories work and what makes for a good story. So when you look at those earlier books that were being published, and some of Duncan's comments and about them, and he would tell you where I heard this story. I heard this from a shepherd in Argyll, from a dike builder, a dry steam diker that I worked with for a while or whatever. There's this kind of absolutely discerning thing about, that's a good story, that's an interesting story, I'm going to remember that story, and that's a story I might tell. And later on, as kind of the sort of storytelling renaissance took shape and whatever, Duncan, although of course he could be a bugger and cause all kinds of grief and say untactful things or whatever, but within Duncan was that ability to discern a good story and a good storyteller. And over many years, I got some of the most fantastically honest and unself-interested and accurate advice from Duncan about storytellers. He had a critical awareness that went very far back, and it sat beside. So that's the rarity of it. Stanley Robertson was another one the same. The rarity of somebody who was absolutely privileged to live within this oral tradition, which he reveled in, but also he had a distinctive artistic awareness about storytelling and stories, and of course the ballad singing side as well, which sat alongside.
It could be slightly awkward when they chose to tell you those things when they were sat next to you in the concert with the other people. That was the only problem, is like quite often they would say it loudly enough for the people to overhear how they were being artistically criticised.
No. Sometimes,
but it was very accurate.
Just had to get out for a fag and Duncan's, whatever. Anyway,
so
such is life.
We're skipping a lot, but I mean, because I'm still really interested in the rest of your childhood and kind of from that moment of being the 7-year-old who's really inspired. But we have moved on to Duncan, and how did you come to meet Duncan? What was your sort of first interaction with him?
So there was an interesting thing going on in the late 70s and the early 80s. I, who, as you've kind of described, had done all that swotty academic-y stuff. In all of that at that time, in Scottish society and culture, there was very little attention or interest in the Indigenous culture of Scotland. We weren't taught about that at school. It was not it was not widely studied. There was a general kind of cultural awareness that was all kind of old hat and parochial, and we didn't want to go there. But in the 70s, there was really a resurgence of interest, and I got very much caught up in that in university years. And I made this big decision to shift over to the School of Scottish Studies, where the amazing Hamish Henderson was in action. There was all this stuff going on. And it was really through that ambience, because it was at the School of Scottish Studies that, although they were generating this kind of radical sense of what Scottish culture might mean politically, socially, educationally, and all the rest of it for the contemporary time, they were also busy recording tradition bearers, singers, and storytellers, including Duncan. And somewhere we were in the same swim. I didn't directly know Duncan. I hadn't met him at that juncture in the late 70s. But we were part of a common environment, and that became kind of very physical. This is where we get to the Netherbow, right there in the heart of the old town, and the wee arts centre there that I got involved in, and all the rest of it. Well, there were also publishers, and the Canongate publishers were just round the corner, and they were the first people who published Duncan's stories in a written form for a wider cultural audience, not just for an academic or a, folk studies kind of group, but for a wider thing. And if I can remember, so I think they put out a collection of Duncan's Fireside Tales of the Traveller people, that'd be early 80s. And I can remember that being launched in the cafe of the old arts centre, because there was this kind of energy beginning to generate. And
I suppose because I didn't realise that that's a radical thing. So that was quite a radical thing to do, because I mean, I think of sort of Scotland being very proud of its heritage and of its folk culture, but that was a real turning point then.
It was, and we have to be honest and say, there was a strong political component by that, as well as cultural. And there was also a psychology thing about it. And I think that made the Duncans and the Stanleys, Sheila Stewart, the Travellers, quite important, because you see this thing about there having been a lack of social and cultural attention to real Scottish culture. I mean, there was all the kind of, bagpipes and haggis stuff. Andy Stewart and all that going on, White Heather Club, etc. But you know, the real thing. So there was this almost kind of psychological suppression thing had gone on, where people had said, "Okay, so that's our culture, but you know, hey, we're not going there. You know, we've got to do this other thing about, you know, modernity and towing the line and economics and all the rest of it."
You
And you
don't sound
see,
terribly English.
yes, no. Well, it was because I mean, I'm not. I'm not in the business of blaming the English here, incidentally, in any
No, no,
shape or
no, but I
form.
mean, that's a
Because
very English
we
attitude. Maybe we're a bit behind you and catching
we
up.
bought into this stuff. Scotland bought into this stuff pretty wholeheartedly, and then suddenly this kind of eruption of something different. Now think about Duncan. I mean, any less suppressed person psychologically and culturally did you ever meet? So that was part of the power of this thing, that, you know, all of this stuff was going on, and here was this guy who was utterly at home with his cultural inheritance, with its creative potential, with its psychological energy, with its connection with the Scottish landscape and the sense of nature, with a sense of tradition, blah, 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 with a sort of internationalism. So, yeah, so, and I keep having to be honest about this. You know, as sometimes people say, "Oh, you know, isn't it amazing what's happened in storytelling in Scotland, kind of well organized, been whatever." And I always say you have to look at the social and cultural circumstances that kind of created an atmosphere for this, that just gave the opportunities, you know. And obviously that's an ongoing narrative. We're still in the middle of all that somewhere.
So were you there kind of the first time that you tried to take Duncan into like the Netherbow and the art centre? Because I mean it's quite a different thing to go and tell stories in a theatre.
Yeah.
And
So
around campfire. And Duncan, I think certainly for a while, kind of, because there was the big thing in the 60s about the ballads and the folk music. But the stories were a poor relation, and it's a very different quality of listening.
Yeah. And I mean, it wasn't really until later on that it was even kind of articulated or recognized that some of these great ballad singers were also storytellers, you know. But so I felt there was something odd that storytellers were being recorded, you know, at the university as if they were a kind of museum thing. Okay, so that was all great. That was good. They were beginning to go into schools, and of course that's where Linda Williamson did a great, fantastic job on supporting Duncan and organizing him to go and visit schools and all the rest of it. But as far as the public arts world was, this didn't exist. It was hidden. It was a secret. It was somewhere on the side. And I thought there's something wrong with that. And there was an odd moment. Again, it's back to this kind of physical, local energy and environment there in the old town of Edinburgh. I was sitting one day in the cafe, as one does, and I was holding forth to some, well, not some, a woman, Eileen Ray, who was the arts officer for the city council. Wonderful woman, actually, who was a huge supporter of ours. And I said, "Eileen, what we need in Edinburgh, we need a storytelling festival." And Eileen, you know, is nodding away, saying that'd be very interesting. And like, so I don't have a quiet voice. And this woman got up from 3 tables away, and she came across and said, "I hope you don't mind me interrupting," she said, "but I just heard you talking there about storytelling. Now, I'm the wife of Duncan Williamson, the storyteller. And I just want to say that if you did something like that, I'm sure that he would be very delighted to come and take part." And that was the seed. And a few months
Hey, Linda.
we had, but when we started it, we had one weekend, and I was terrified that nobody would come, We didn't even have it in the theatre. We had it in a small gallery space. I thought, what if nobody comes? And, you know, Duncan's agreed to come and whatever, whatever. But of course, people did come. And from the very first moment, I realized there's something here, because not only did people love the stories, but actually there was this thing from the very beginning. I could feel people are drawn to this. They want to tell these stories. There are teachers, there are environments, there are people who have come to this thing because they're hungry for this, but they're hungry to be participants. This is not a passive audience. And that was the beginning of it. Yeah.
And were you one of those hungry participants? Was that when you kind of got the bug to start telling yourself?
No. So I organized it all. And as I would always say, having already spent a couple of decades of my life listening to stories, at least the first decade of all this starting festivals and storytelling events and all the rest of it, I was an intensive listener. I listened. I went with people to events. I organized events. I listened, and I listened. And I'm still more of a listener than anything else.
Well, you know what Duncan would say? That's what makes a good storyteller.
Well, you can't, without listeners, there's no storytelling, without active listening. And you see, that's the clue to another whole thing, okay? Storytelling has all this creativity and psychic energy and all the rest of it, but it also always has a function. It always has a function and a practical a contribution within any group or social or cultural setting. And that was so clear from the beginning of everything, that storytelling was going to have a social and psychological and cultural contribution in a lot of practical ways. And that's burgeoned, you know, storytelling and healing, storytelling and education, storytelling and environment. There's always a practical. I could see some people desperate to get in with a point or a question. That Adrian Johnson man.
Hello, well, talking about...
He's another irrepressible, you see.
Well, and also another who was a very fabulous arts officer as well. I mean, hugely supportive in the West Midlands for Festival at the Edge and getting storytelling happening in the West Midlands in the same way that Eileen Ray was for you. Yeah. So no, it's not a passive audience. That's why you're all on mute, Adrian, because if I let all of you talk all the time, it would be chaos. But the chat is there and we are listening, and there is also a Q&A. So if you have questions and things that you really want to know from Donald and that you want me to ask him and you want to talk about, put them on the Q&A. Yes, great. Yeah, it's there. Get writing, Adrian. And I promise I will ask you some. I will ask Donald some of your questions. But we've been talking so much about stories. We've been getting into the nitty gritty, and I want to hear more about kind of how storytelling has burgeoned in Scotland and how it's really changed in those decades, because it has really blossomed, and it's become just integral, I think, in the cultural scene in storytelling, certainly the traditional scene and in the art sector in Scotland. But we were talking about stories and things that were coming into your head and things. We were talking about a story that you were thinking that's just sort of been haunting you today. And I think it'd be really nice to take a breather and actually hear a story if you've got one for us.
Okay, so a story just bubbled into my head today. I was thinking, I know that this isn't a kind of storytelling session and whatever, and we're here to discuss questions and I'm not going to
Well,
launch.
maybe it's still about stories. They can't talk about
Okay.
stories for now not have any.
So I'll tell you, and this slightly bumps in my head. So one of the things that I was lucky as a child, both in Ireland, but also back here in Scotland, because when I was 7, I actually moved out from Glasgow to a more rural area on the outskirts of Stirling. And it was that thing about people who could take you around and tell you, oh, in that place, such and such happened. Okay. And my old uncle in Ireland would do that. He would take you and say, oh, do you see that old house? And I would say, oh, well, why is it all shut up? And he would say, well, such and such happened there. And off he went, you know, there was a murder or whatever. Now, one time I was reading up in a guy, Hugh Miller. He was a very interesting self-taught stonemason who became a geologist, who wrote a lot about the culture and society of the Highlands of Scotland and Easter Ross. And he had an uncle who took him round. And one time, his uncle, they were walking around the Tarbert Peninsula, just north of where they came from in Cromarty. And his uncle pointed out to him a house, an old croft house, and he said, oh, he said, there's an interesting story about this house. This came back into my head today. So there were these 2 young lassies, young girls, and they were brought up in the same village in Tarbetness there in Easter Ross. And they were very, very close. You know, they went to school together. They did everything together. They were inseparable. And when they were just maybe 11, 12 or whatever, there was an old lady who died in the village. And this old biddy, she'd been on her own for a while. She was very old, whatever. So there was no immediate family. There was no huge grief about it. But of course, the body had to be laid out and washed and prepared for burial by the village women, as was the tradition. And the 2 young girls were invited to come and see this. It was the first time they'd ever seen a dead body laid out, washed. And as was a bit the way in that time, particularly as there was no huge grief around it, the women were joking and having a drink. And, you know, there was a bit of a wee wake going on, and it wasn't all quiet and respectful. And the 2 young lassies were horrified. They're absolutely horrified by this, women drinking and laughing and having jokes. They were just completely shocked by this. And they swore to each other that whenever the other one died, the friend would be there and would wash the body and do everything in a loving and respectful and close way. They swore to each other on their lives that whatever happened, they would do that for one another. Young lassies. So, of course, time passed. They both got married. And one stayed on in the Tarbert Peninsula in a little farm there. And the other one moved south onto the next peninsula, Nig. And although as the crow flies, that's quite a short distance, there's actually, you know, a stretch of water between and all the rest. So it wasn't a straightforward and easy journey. And the young woman who was married near where they'd been brought up, she had a baby. And the word came that the friend was going to also have a child. And then the word came, somebody came with the awful news that the lass had died in childbirth. And could her friend come to help lay out the body? Well, the trouble was that the lassie in Tarbert at the farm was there on her own with the baby. Her husband and the farm workers had all gone to the fair in the nearby town. She was there on her own. She couldn't leave, that she had no transport and all the rest of it. And it was quite a journey to go to where her friend had died. But of course, she felt terrible about it because they'd made the promise, they'd made that promise. And there they were, both as mothers, and here this lass had died giving birth, and her baby had died. So she sat on, hoping against hope that the husband and the farm folk would come back from the fair and she would be able to set out. And she went out, she toed and froed, she had the baby by the fire, out she went to look, back she came in, out she went to look, no sign. Until she went out and she could see this kind of figure coming over the brow of the hill, and she thought, oh, thank God, that will be the maid, the maid of the farm, the milkmaid or whatever, coming back. And she went in to kind of sort the baby by the fire. And there was this kind of disturbance and noise from the cows and the byre, because of course the byre was adjacent to the cottage, and you opened through the byre into the little farm cottage. And there was this disturbance in the byre of the cows and the mooing and the disturbance. And the woman turned round, and here was this figure in white had come, and she was there in the room, and there was the fire, and there was the baby, and there was the young farmer's wife, and there was this figure dressed in white and pale, chalk pale and white, in a skeletal face. And immediately the young woman knew it was her friend. And the woman sat down by the fire in shock, and this apparition sat on the other side of the fire and looked straight at the young woman in a gaze of intense reproach and grief. And they sat, it seemed like an eternity, and the fire was going down, and the young mother was so worrying about the baby, and she kept sort of surreptitiously trying to put a little more fuel, wood and straw onto the fire. But eventually the fire went out. The cold became more and more intense, and she sat there, and this figure stared at her with these hollowed out, intense eyes, with this gaze of reproach and grief, till eventually she didn't know how long she was there or whatever, but there was a noise of a cart, a horse and cart, arriving in the yard. She thought, God, thank God, this is them finally coming back. And as that noise came, the wraith stood up, took one look at her, and then turned and fled back through the byre. And as she turned and fled, again, the cattle were disturbed. There was a mooing, they were lashing out and kicking, and there was an unearthly scream that then disappeared and faded, and the figure had gone. And the young woman just fell into the arms of her husband and the other, and she was just trying to explain what had happened and what had gone through. So the next morning, she set out, and she was too late. She got there to the next peninsula at Nig, and to the house, and the body of the young woman, her friend, had already been washed and laid out, but she hadn't been buried. She was there laid out in the bed, and the young farmer's wife went through to see her. And she went, and the body was laid out, and it looked peaceful. And she went forward, and she touched the hand, the frozen hand of the friend. And then she turned and she stroked her hand down the body. And then she saw and she raised the white winding cloth, and she saw the bruise, the mark of a cow's hoof print, a bruise on the young woman's leg. And then she was there for the burial. I think that's an interesting story, and about female friendship, about death, and also I think it touches this awful thing at the moment, this almost primeval thing of not being able to be there when a loved one dies, and the whole process of the saying farewell, the ceremony of that, the connectedness of that, and the grieving of that is something that's been is completely disrupted for people in this present situation. I think that's what brought that story to my mind. It's an interesting story, and I suppose it's an example again of the thing of how traditional stories have a kind of resilience, a kind of life to them that just then, you know, comes to the fore in a different way, can have a different connection, emotional connection in different circumstances.
That was a fantastic story. And and I think you're absolutely right. I think all the most powerful stories are, on the face of it, very simple, but they're just about the human condition and human emotion and how we deal with life. And it is one of those things. I mean, I certainly kind of have stories that I tell and maybe perform, and then the stories that I would tell to friends, and stories that are just kind of my heart stories, that are the stories that are just the ones that are in my head and in my daily being, and kind of come at different times in my life and are kind of my companions for that period. And kind of, there's certainly stories that I've heard when I was a child and I just didn't get, and then suddenly kind of you come to a point in your life and go, that's why there's that story. This is the time that I need that story. I heard it then and it didn't make any sense. Now it's become part of me and now I get it.
Which is why it's so important to be a listener, to always be, because it's by hearing the story from outside that you receive that sense of connection. And I know we can all be clever and we can read versions of stories and we can adapt and we think that's a good one and that's, you know, blah, blah, blah. But I think that there's an extraordinary thing that's why I think that the open storytelling sessions like our, you know, good crack clubs and better crack clubs and all the rest of it are very critically important. And I'll tell you a funny thing about all that. I remember it would be, there was a good crack. It was 2 days after my father died. And I remember thinking that there was hardly anything in the world I would have gone out to in that circumstance. But I went to the Good Crack Club. I didn't tell a story. I didn't say to anybody, my father's just died, whatever. I don't know, whatever. I just sat there and I went home feeling that was good. I'm glad I went there. Just to listen, just to be part of that little community of story sharing and telling at that time. So it's interesting. It meets a kind of real need. And of course, it has to be entertaining as well, you know. You can't have solemn, you know, worthiness. We had all that with Presbyterianism. We've done all that in Scotland. We don't want to go there again, you know.
No, not solemn worthiness, but there's a room for a little bit of solemnity, and there's room for just, it's that thing about touching something real, isn't it?
I know. I know.
Touching something that is deeply real and yet more than real at the same time, that
Oh,
beyond the bounds of maybe what we would accept in everyday life, and yet it's about real things. And that combination of reality and magic is just very special. And I think those traveller stories, all of the really have that they are just raw. And I mean, you know, we were going to talk a bit, we were sort of running out of time a little bit, but kind of,
yeah, we'll need to have questions if people
well,
want.
yeah, we're definitely going to open it up to questions. But I think kind of people like Sheila and Stanley and Duncan, that they haven't been filtered by the rest of society. It's still kind of those adult stories from people who've really lived extremes.
Yeah. Incidentally, though, the humor is important.
It's also raw.
If we have time, we should have a short, funny story at some point, whatever. Because one of the really important things in storytelling as well is not taking ourselves too seriously. And if there was ever a good bit of advice for aspirant and practicing storytellers, just along the way, remember to tell a few shorter stories that are funny. It can just help everybody through the experience.
Well, I would love to have a joke from you, but I have to say, I've had I've done, this is my fourth taking the tradition on, so it's all sort of a big learning curve. And the first two people that I had were Nick Hennessy. I think Nick's here. Hello, Nick. And then I had David Campbell, and both of them we'd talked on the soul of storytelling. We got down and deep and talked about storytelling, and then both of them at the end caught me completely by surprise by telling a knob joke. And
I've already promised.
You promised me not to, but
there's no hat trick syndrome here.
But we're always very up for a joke. Very up for a joke. Now we've opened the floor. I've said, you know, kind of it's getting on towards the end of our hour, and I thought there would be lots and lots of questions on the Q&A. So this is your chance, everybody. If you have got any questions you want to ask Donald, stick them up now. I've still got quite a lot of things that I would like to ask Donald. There are loads and loads of subjects that we just haven't had a chance to touch on. So I've got lots more questions to ask, or we could just have a joke. But if you have any questions to ask, now is the time. But while they have a bit of a thing and a bit of a type, have you got one of those short stories that you wanted to tell us, or a joke?
Well, I'll mention, but I'll stop this at any point for a story that's coming through. I had a really completely at the other end of kind of storytelling experience. I did a great workshop with Peter Chand, who's a total personal hero of mine, Peter. Somebody who's done a vast amount about organizing, supporting storytelling and storytellers with utter integrity and wonderful ability and all the rest of it. And I was at this thing, and I really recommend this as a way of getting younger people involved in storytelling, where he had a workshop and he was giving everybody, they were all actually Hodja stories. Just so he gives everybody in the workshop a story, and they have to learn it there and then. And he then gets them to record the story like a radio piece, and to add musical accompaniment from a kind of, box of sound effect tricks. And by the end of the workshop, everybody had recorded their story with musical accompaniment, right? Now, it was a most amazing way to get people off the idea that storytelling is about a text, and to actually, you're now going to record this with no text. You have to tell this story, and we're going to have musical effects and whatever. It was so clever. And it was a completely contemporary way to get to the heart of the storytelling thing. Fantastic. But my favorite Hodges story out of that, and I've told this was my favorite story. This is not for cat lovers. Cat lovers, leave the conversation now, So Hodges' friends are going down to the market past his flat, and usually he's sitting out, there, but there's no sign of him. Going past, I'll just summarize this, and they hear this squalling and howling and yowling coming. What on earth's wrong? And into the flat they go up, and here's Hodja at the sink, and he's got his cat by the scruff of the neck down in the sink, and he's scrubbing it with soap. And I said, Hodja, what are you doing? What are you doing? He said, I'm cleaning my cat. What do you think I'm doing? He said, Hodja, you don't need to clean cats. Cats clean themselves. You'll damage. He said, stop interfering. I know what I'm doing. I'm cleaning my cat. Away you go and leave me. The cat, on he goes. And off they go, and they're shaking their heads. The man's lost his sense. Then they'll go down to the market. Coming back, I'd hear Hodja as they come back. He's outside his house, and he's sitting on the step, and the tears are streaming out. He said, oh, my cat. What they said, what's wrong? My cat's dead. My cat's dead. Hodja, we told you. You're doing your cat's dawning. He said, no, you're wrong. He said, it was nothing to do with washing the cat. It was wringing it out afterwards. I love that. Okay. Right, here's a question.
Oh, great. You've got a question. You've got a question from Fiona.
Yeah.
So Fiona's asking, what is your favourite memory of Duncan?
Oh, right. So I have to say this, okay. Amid many wonderful memories, it was the first time that Duncan came to the new storytelling centre, and he wasn't able to come when it opened because he was quite ill. And I went to see him, and I said, okay, Duncan, so you can't come to the one, but look, you're to come at Christmas. Will you come at Christmas and be the main storyteller for Christmas? And he said he would. So he had that in his mind. I had that in our mind. He came at Christmas. Duncan had never liked the old Netherbow theatre space. He always got off the stage, and, it was just a wee houff of a place, but got down amidst the audience, down in the dunny, as it were, and whatever. So we had completely designed this new space with, minimal, virtually no stage, a tiny kind of design, everything to make it work for storytelling. And I thought, what's Duncan going to do? Is he going to walk off this and, whatever? And so I introduced him, I welcomed him. He got out of his seat in the back. He walked forward, and like with this incredible instinct, he found exactly the central spot where you could see everybody eye to eye, whatever, without having to get down out of the sight line and whatever at this point. And he came to a complete stop, and he launched into his first story. And I thought, thank God. £4 million later, we're okay. And I just thought, yeah, that was just the perfect instinct. We'd got the design of this right. It was, yeah. Anyway, it was a big moment. So there's some other wee questions firing in
there. I'm just having a quick. I think most of them are positive experience for you, but do you think the Scottish experience about eventually valuing storytelling from tellers like Duncan is something still relevant in England? And what might be a positive new milestone for this concern being met in any way?
Yeah, so that's something we worked hard at. I think that is a recognition that storytelling is an art form with all these social and cultural connectedness and benefits, and that people who are seriously working at developing storytelling as a contemporary cultural and artistic experience deserve the same recognition and support as musicians and visual artists and all the rest of it. And that's an argument that I think we have won in Scotland. You can't be complacent. It's not an ideal situation. We have to go on working at it. But I think we have won that argument in Scotland. We've had to be self-disciplined about how we organize ourselves to win that argument. And I think that in some cultures across the world, there's still a wonderful recognition of the role of storytellers. But I think that in many more developed and contemporary cultures, there's still a back drag about people not understanding what storytelling is about and why it should be supported. And that's where we need to work, whether it's England or it's Scotland or it's Europe, Infest or wherever it is, and connecting with traditional cultures and contemporary movements and storytelling across the world to support each other in that cause.
I mean, I'm wondering, Adrian, are you saying that because about being relevant in England, because you don't think we have storytellers like Duncan and the other sort of travellers in England? I mean, I suppose one of the things I think in England is just it is important to value those people, and it's important to value the culture that is developed in this country, the folk culture. One of the reasons I think it's so important is because we are such a melting point, and there's so many cultures coming in that are meeting in England, that there needs to be the stories of this land to be swapped. And I think we need to really welcome all of those other cultures. I mean, like, you know, storytellers like Peter Chand are so important, of that mixing of the daily life of Wolverhampton with kind of the stories that his family have brought with him from India, and kind of we've got stories coming from all over the world. And I think that's one of the problems that we have in England, is that there isn't, there's nothing to meet them with. I think the vast majority of people in England don't know enough about the past cultures that have come into England. And, you know, because I think we have ownership of a lot of the Viking stories as well, because so many of those have come into the shores, and that those layers and layers and layers of stories. And if you know your own history, and if you know your folk traditions and your stories, then you've got something to swap, and there's something to celebrate. But you can't celebrate everything coming in if there's a hollow center. I'm trying to keep that brief, because that's quite a big old debate, and I'm sort of might end up on my soapbox.
But just think, a great age of storytelling can still be to come in England.
Well, I think
it's never been more needed. It's never been more needed for all the reasons you're talking about. Cultural exchange and connectedness and diversity, and the recognition of regional identity and traditions and linguistic diversity and all that. I feel really, really strongly that you know, we shouldn't think, okay, so there's been these issues and struggles, but lots of fantastic things about storytelling in England. It's we're only in the beginning of the journey there. I think storytelling's got a huge contribution to make in England, and it won't happen the same way in Scotland as in Scotland. Everywhere is different. I love the English traditions, and I love the multicultural thing, and there's never been more need in English society for the kind of connectedness that
it's amazing what's been happening online over the last few weeks. But I mean, I had a scary moment in September when I realised I'd been telling stories for 30 years and been involved in English storytelling for 30 years. And English storytelling is in a completely different place to the way that it was 30 years ago. And the amount that it's changed, the huge number of clubs and festivals. I mean, just simply the fact that now when I say, you know, people say, what do you do? And I say I'm a storyteller. They have some idea of what it is. So it used to be people who go, oh, what, you mean like you read to kids? And now the response tends to be, oh, we had a storyteller come into the school when I was a child and it was brilliant. Was it you? And they're going, it probably was, and you're a grown-up. But it's a totally different scene, and in a really positive way.
It's going to go from strength to strength, and lots of new people are coming in, and they're the lifeblood.
And that it is. There's so many people coming, and people of all ages. And there's so many things to talk about with you, but we are just about out of time. So hang on, we've got another question on the Q&A. Any chance of having online workshop, all three, from Donald and or others while the plague lasts? I'm particularly interested in the nitty-gritty technical details. I really like the idea of building a connection with the audience for starting a story. Well, I think this is something that could definitely be done by the Scottish Storytelling Centre.
Yeah, we could. We should all be collaborating, I think, in this kind of lockdown time about how much we can develop and share through this online, because in a way we've got more time to listen to each other in a new way, you know. Thanks, Nick. See ya. People.
Yes, thanks, Nick.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna save the chat for you, and Perthy, I'm not. I'm getting everybody's names wrong. I apologise for pronouncing things wrong. But yes, we will have talks. I'm going to ask one last question before we finish it off now. But we're both on Facebook and we're both up for conversations and messaging and all of those things. But you have done an amazing thing by, you know, obviously with help and with support and with Arts Council funding and support in Scotland and from the government, but you did set up the Scottish Storytelling Centre, and it is quite an amazing achievement to have a place like that on the Royal Mile in the centre of Edinburgh. And I know that you're kind of starting to step back a little bit now to let others take on those roles and to give you a chance to do storytelling as well. But what would you like your legacy to be? What would you like to see now? Where would you like storytelling in Scotland to go?
Sure. So I don't care about my legacy. That's irrelevant. It's a collective thing. What I would like to see is every area developing its own expression of this contemporary sense of storytelling. And, you know, I always say every community should have a storytelling centre. It might be the local cafe or the library or the pub. Everywhere needs a storytelling centre. And that's where we have to go. So, you know, having a Scottish storytelling centre was never an end in itself. It's a channel. And, you know, we've got the Orkney Storytelling Festival. We've got tremendous activity. There's this huge upsurge in environmental storytelling, which is going on in Perthshire, connected with the Cranach Centre there. There's activity in our, there's Fife is sort of seems to be producing this whole race of strong women storytellers. This way, it's got to multiply in different ways in every community. That's the way forward. And if we're going to learn anything out of this current trauma, it's the absolute importance of this core human connection. That's the most important thing, and that's what's going to see us through this. And storytelling is an expression of that, and it nurtures it. You know, what could be more important?
Well, you're talking to the converted here.
Never mind the old Swords Brigade. Never mind the old Swords Brigade. Get on with it. You're listening to me, Mike Rust. Get on with it.
Well, and talking to Mike Rust, thank you again to Get a Words in Edgeways, because I'm borrowing their Zoom account and they're letting me do all sorts of storytelling connected things with it. So I'm very grateful for having the Zoom to play with.
There's a shout out from Fife. That's good.
And I know, hooray, Fife women. Yes, strong women storytellers. I'm all in favour of that. I think that's marvellous. Obviously, there are lots of places to follow this up. There's the Scots Story Forum. Fiona McDougall's here, and she's sort of got a central role in the Scots Story Forum and tracks. And there's lots of things that you can sign up to there through the Scottish Storytelling Centre to hear more about storytelling in Scotland and the online things that you're doing at the moment. I've got a Facebook page. You can message me through that and talk to me through that. So it doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. I'm going to be here next week again. So next week is a bit of a deviation. We're not going to be talking about Duncan Williamson at all next week, I don't think, if I can manage that for an hour. We'll see. It might not be possible. So next week I'm welcoming Sheila Arnold, who is going to be coming to Blast on Friday the 8th of May. So we'll be putting Sheila Arnold on. And then in 2 weeks' time here on Taking the Tradition On, we were talking a little bit about Linda Williamson tonight, who was Duncan's wife, and just made a lot of that kind of transition from the traveller way of life into the outer world and kind of embracing and being so generous to the outer world possible. She transcribed all of Duncan's books, to transcribe the stories and work with him and with the publishers. So she's got lots of interesting and exciting things that she'll be talking about. So there's going to be loads and loads going on. Non-disclosing participants. Oh, should I? I'm not quite sure what that is. Maybe that's part of a private conversation that's come out. I know quite often if I'm doing private messaging, I end up doing it to attendees or panelists. Or Lynn, tell me a little bit more if I have missed something. So thank you all for coming. It'll be available again on YouTube, Lynn, because I know you missed the beginning. If you wanted to see what we were talking about, if we were referring back, you can see the beginning again. And thank you all for coming, and thank you very, very much to you, Donald, for coming and taking the time to talk to us tonight, and for the fantastic story and for your wonderful company. So
good luck, everybody. Keep well. Keep well.
Thank you, Donald.
Well, all the best.
Night. Yes.
See you soon.
Take care and stay well, stay sane, look after yourselves, everybody, and see you next week.